Hello, good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started in just 10 seconds. Okay, so thank you everybody so much for coming here today and sparing your precious time during these very pressed final few days of the COP27 conference. We know there's so many other things that you could be doing, so thank you very much for sparing your energy for this vital topic of loss and damage. My name is George Carey-Jones, and I'm from the UK Youth Climate Coalition, thank you, which is a climate justice-focused, volunteer-led organization for 18 to 29-year-olds from across the United Kingdom. And I'm joined in moderation today by Jacopo Benzini from the Italian Climate Network. And we're blessed to be joined by a panel of wonderful experts on loss and damage as well. So they will be introduced properly in a moment. But before then, I'd like to take some time to reflect upon the history of loss and damage negotiations within COP. Having emerged as a relatively late recognized demand of COP27, the momentum on loss and damage has been building rapidly throughout the year. Those of you in the room linked with civil society organizations will know that the demand has been building and building, and loss and damage has been popping up on agenda items for a number of different movements, whether it's youth organization within climate justice or health justice campaigns. Everyone is interested in loss and damage and what it can do to democratize climate finance going forward. A network of loss and damage advocacy organizations have been set up, and the loss and damage justice items have never been more prominent at any international climate summit before than they are now. And for this reason, expectations were historically high coming into this COP that there could be a step change when it came to financial justice within the UNFCCC process. And the outcomes that certain civil society organizations expected were very clear. We wanted money to be committed. We wanted things like facilities or funds to be established, and also historical liability or responsibility to be recognized, depending on which organization you were speaking to. So this begs the question of where we are at now, with negotiations having gone for over 10 days already, and to decipher everything that's happening between the negotiation rooms and all of the many pavilions at COP, we have a number of experts with us, and I will pass over to my friend Jacopo to guide us through the structure of the talk today.
Thank you very much, George, for the very kind introduction. As Italian Climate Network, it's a pleasure to organize this third side event in a row with the UK Youth Coalition on Climate Change. And as Italian Climate Network, we are a network of young experts and scientists, and during the year we go in schools in Italy. We bring climate education into schools, and during COPs and the intersessionals we monitor what happens inside the rooms and send daily bulletins in Italian and English every morning at 7, but that's just advertising. Getting back to the event, I have the feeling that when we decided to have this event together, we were thinking about the first week maybe. When we decided the title, moving forward from this COP with the Loss and Damage Finance Facility, we were still thinking that the process would have needed some more push from the civil society part. And we have seen that starting from the very first day of this COP, the Egyptian presidency decided to stick to the point of having loss and damage financing on the agenda, and I would say that this title that we chose at the time couldn't have been more timely given what is happening in the rooms right now with the additional rounds of negotiation, with the second iteration of the draft of the cover decision, and understanding whether there will be a decision on starting a fund immediately, or whether this fund could be part of a mosaic of solutions in the next years to come, and let's say more specifically in the next 2 years and until COP29. We thought about having a workshop moment after a first panel discussion with the youth activists, civil society being in the room, and that's the very standard of the of all events that we organize together as ICN together with the UKYCCC, and the idea is to bring the ideas of those who cannot organize a side event, of those who cannot speak in a plenary, to the stage, so to have some progress every year and also to hear different voices and to provide the most open setting as possible that we can. So without further ado, I introduce the speakers of today's session, and we're very honored to have you with us, guys, because it's not easy to coordinate well before leaving for a COP. And on this discussion today, on this 30-year path of inaction, I would say, from Rio 1992, when the first definition of what loss and damage could have been in the future, to 2022 today, we have seen mitigation being not enough in terms of policies. We have seen adaptation coming as a consequence, perhaps, of this inaction. And now we are talking about loss and damage as the most central issue of this COP. And we will be accompanied in this part today, this afternoon, by Sharon Kisheni from Tanzania, from Climate Action Network Africa, Jefferson Estela from the Philippines, from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, another friend organization we always have side events together, and also with Rebecca Thyssen from the Centre National de Coopération Développement, Belgium, 11-11-11. And each speaker today will start somehow from a keyword, which is the same keyword we will give you back in the second part of this moment together, and from which you can start with the discussion. So I would start from Sharon Kisheni. You choose the word compensation. At what point are we, according to Climate Action Network International, and according to you specifically, and how can we help the process in the rooms?
Greetings, everyone. First of all, I would like to appreciate for this invitation. As a youth and Can Africa in general, we are very honored and privileged to be part of this crucial discussion. As we all know, it is clear that communities, particularly the vulnerable communities and marginalized groups in the global south, are facing devastating impacts of the climate crisis. Floods, such as Pakistan, severe and frequent droughts in East Africa, food insecurity, and resource or natural source-based conflicts. Climate-induced impacts have caused loss of properties, loss of cultural heritage, loss of identity, extinction of flora and fauna, and death of people. Communities cannot adapt to these consequences, so definitely they need compensation. Compensation to the impacts that are caused by natural and human impacts, human activities. Most of the impacts or the consequences of climate change are the result of human consequences of human activities. That the parties has agreed to the wording and institutionalization of the operationalization of the Santiago Network on loss and damage. It is a welcoming move, but technically, we need to help the communities and at the front line of loss and damage. However, there needs to be a clear framework that sets a plan for concrete implementation of this initiative with clear responsibilities and mechanisms for measuring outcomes of the process so that the countries can be held accountable for their emissions and their impacts as a result of such emissions. There have been some bilateral as a result of this COP, in which some developed states have promised the support to developing countries, including Belgium to Mozambique, UK to Kenya, and it is a welcoming move that sends the right signal. However, we need a transparent and accountable loss and damage facility, which is accessible to all vulnerable states. The child peak by the global north on which country to provide help on loss and damage, it is not sustainable and it's quite unfair to the rest of the global south. Disappointingly, the global north has united to again procrastinate the setting up of loss and damage finance mechanism by pushing it to 2024. We do not see justice being delivered to the millions of community members suffering from climate crisis, and mostly African countries or developing countries. As much as we are not the big cause for climate change or the consequences of climate change, but we suffer a lot, yet we contribute to less than 4% of the global cause for climate change impacts. Compensation and reparations are moral imperative that need to be underscored by the global north. They should feel the pain of the climate crisis in their skin, so as to resonate with the suffering communities and urgently set up the new, adequate, accessible, and sustainable loss and damage finance mechanism. This is what we are hoping at this COP. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and also as a network of European organizations under the wider CAN Europe umbrella, the Climate Action Network umbrella, we've launched some awareness projects during 2022, and especially as part of the wider Spark consortium, of which many of the organizations in the room today are part. We have also launched an awareness campaign together with the very well-known activist Elizabeth Watuti from Kenya. We have been collecting signatures all over Europe on a letter on how important loss and damage is for endangered communities. And we have the feeling that this kind of political pressure with content, not just pushing the political part, but with this kind of content and feel of urgency have somehow reached the COP. And I will immediately leave the floor to Jefferson Estella from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, who decided to provide us a keyword for further discussions in the second part, the word youth. But Jefferson, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, I'm Jefferson Estella. I'm based from the Philippines. I'm a climate activist and a community organizer. For the past years, I've been working with my local organization, Youth Strike for Climate Philippines, and this is one of the leading youth-led movements in the Philippines pushing for the declaration of climate emergency in our country. And recently, I've been part of the National Inquiry of Climate Change as a community reviewer. The Landmark Inquiry is an investigation into the corporate responsibility of major polluters, companies such as Coca-Cola and others, for the losses and damages that has been happening from a country through the climate crisis. It was launched by the Philippine Commission on Human Rights after typhoons, survivors and civil society groups filed complaints before the Commission last 2015, calling for a probe into the possible human rights violations of the 47 biggest fossil fuel, plastic and cement companies resulting from climate change. From that, I've also been working for Loss and Damage Youth Coalition as a Southeast Asia and Pacific coordinator. It's a coalition of youth from the global north and south who have come together to demand action on addressing loss and damage caused by the climate crisis. From that, we all heard and know that my country is one of the most vulnerable nations in the world with the impacts of climate crisis. We are being hit by average of 20 storms and typhoon per year, which is generally destroy crops, homes, infrastructure, and already impoverished areas. Loss and damage are tied to a destructive dependence on fossil fuels, including oil and gas, and it affects young people, the youth in the Philippines and all over the world. From 2010 to 2020, the Philippines incurred around 515 billion pesos in losses and damages. It is around 10.6 billion US dollars in losses and damages brought by the climate-related disasters. Just before I go here, a week ago, severe tropical storm Paeng hit the country, and it's an unfortunate but timely reminder of the reality of the crisis in a country like ours. That's why these climate negotiations are crucial to the survival of millions of Filipinos, especially young Filipinos, and all young people all over the world. And we expect that this crisis to be treated with nothing less but the urgency it demands. That being said, COP27 needs not to be just ambitious, but it also needs to send a signal that we are serious about implementation. And one of the most important components of that is the financing. For developing countries to be able to do well in future, despite the effects of climate change, the amount of money given to help them deal with disasters and their aftermath is fundamentally not enough. As developing nations in the global south, like my country, are forced to deal with the effects of the climate crisis, as we still recover from the last one, wealthy nations will need to provide unequivocal assurances that necessary finance will be made available and that it will be made available at the magnitude and rate necessary to meet our demands. Developed countries, we all know this, have resisted for a very long time an effort to recognize loss and damage because of liabilities and potential claims for compensation that might emanate from that. We cannot allow rich polluters, countries to ignore, undermine, and block this issue anymore. What wealthy nations must do is to take the required first step to agree that the funding to deal with loss and damage is on the table so that COP27 can come up with a meaningful solution to the growing number of people who are suffering from climate-related crisis and how they are all linked. The recent devastating floods from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from the Philippines, displacing millions of people are evidence of the profound inequality and injustice caused by wealthy polluters who have undoubtedly emitted greenhouse gases and block financial aid for those facing the impacts of the climate crisis. Loss and damage financing will determine the success or failure of the climate summit that is happening right now with our very own eyes. The integrity of climate negotiations is uncertain if this issue continues to be resolved. Today, it is unmistakably that loss and damage is the intergenerational injustice of our generation. We need to take action to address it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jefferson. As you can see from the event slide behind us, we are also waiting for an intervention or a greeting from a delegate, from the delegate on loss and damage from Antigua and Barbuda, but actually we just got notice that the consultations and sessions on loss and damage are still ongoing in a different format after the head of delegation plenary, so we'll see whether he will be able to join us, but in the meantime, I would like to give the floor to Rebecca Thyssen to conclude with the last speaker, this first part, and then back to my friend and colleague George for continuation. Rebecca, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It works? Good afternoon. Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're feeling still in shape and awake after those 2 long weeks. It's just one day before the official end of this COP. I say official because I imagine nobody is naive and it will be very hard to finish on time. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. sounds a bit like unrealistic. So to give a little state of play, I'm not aware of all the negotiation and the state of play of all of them, but just maybe on loss and damage because that's why we are all here. The state of play is very tense, very complex, very divisive. We've been following closely the negotiation for now more than a week on loss and damage finance by the time we had the agenda and the process starting. And progress is being very, very slow. And that's very, very concerning, as you may all know. So what we've been noticing as well in the different negotiating rooms is that we saw delaying tactics, but also blocking strategy from some specific countries and groups. I'm also talking mostly about developed countries. For example, we heard a lot, especially at the beginning of the negotiation, we need more time. The question is, how much time more do you need? Haven't we been talking about this for 30 years? Haven't we already been doing dialogues, workshop, interministerial submissions again and again on loss and damage? How much time more do you need? We also have been hearing, we need to know the gaps. The gaps are known. There is no loss and damage finance so far. The needs are huge and will just increase and increase as much that we don't meet and fulfill our mitigation and adaptation commitments. Another argument that we heard is that we are already doing our part. We are already doing something. So first question, climate finance, anyone? 100 billion commitment not reached at all by 2020? So we could be a bit suspicious, of course. But then another counter-argument that we can oppose is, of course, loss and damage does not exist yet, right? Loss and damage finance is not yet flowing. But then if you get a bit closer to what happened at this COP27, we saw a lot, almost a festival of pledges going through loss and damage finance, which is, of course, in a way positive. It's fitting in a very positive dynamic, I would say. Would you imagine 1 year ago having a country pledging for loss and damage money? That was almost impossible. Scotland was the first sub-country region doing it, following by Wallonia in Glasgow. But before that, it was really, we called it a taboo, right? Nobody was ever putting money on the table for loss and damage. But in a year, many things changed. I think we got also a bit of maturity regarding what loss and damage finance could mean. So we got Denmark right before the COP pledging money, Germany, Austria, Ireland, New Zealand, France, the US, a lot of countries stepping up for loss and damage finance. And we need to acknowledge that there's a way forward and that it's positive. But the problem of those pledges is, first, most of them are not additional. So it means that we're actually relabeling climate finance money, mostly project going towards adaptation funds, in loss and damage money. This is not what we need. We need more money. We need to scale up the money to address loss and damage, not to just relabel some adaptation money to look cool at the COP. It will also be very hard to try to monitor all those commitments. It's on a voluntary base. Every country can pledge whatever it wants, but then it's very hard for the partners, for the beneficiary, to make sure that this money is actually flowing at the right place on the right time, right? So it's also a matter of accountability. And another big elephant in the room was this new proposal of the Global Shield. You may have heard of it, right? This huge new insurance scheme. I think there are good side of it, good bit of it. But globally, one of the biggest risks regarding this initiative is to divert the debate of where it should be right now, meaning the establishment of a loss and damage facility. Jefferson said it, Sharon said it, this is why we need it. They explain it very, very well. Why do we need it? Because of the impacts we know and the impacts that will grow more and more. But it's also a matter of trust. It's also what we call it the litmus test of this COP. How much do you want to negotiate? How much do you want to convene every year if we are not able to put concrete action in climate justice? Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I forgot to mention that your keyword was tactics, indeed. George?
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. I think we certainly heard about the rationale for loss and damage finance from Sharon. We've heard about the need from Jefferson, and we've heard about the strategies at play from Rebecca. It brings lots of questions to my mind, at least. How do you fund the considered unfundable? How do you ensure the uninsurable? how do you touch the untouchable points of negotiation? And I guess the beauty of the loss and damage discussion right now is that a lot of these previous boxes that were considered closed are now being opened. So this leads us to a point where we'd love to hear from you in the audience and any questions you have for our speakers. My magical assistant, Jacopo, will be going around with the microphone. So if you do have any questions, please raise your hand. And in the interim, whilst people think about things to say, there's a question that we can have from myself, which is in regards to the scenario in which you know, a number of countries have been talking about a mosaic solution. I think we've heard, particularly within the G77 bloc. So a question for the group: do you think that the language on mosaic solutions is constructive, or do you consider it a destructive narrative at the moment? Who would like to speak first? Anyone can go.
It works? Yeah? Well, the narrative around the mosaic of solution was first brought by the Maldives, but then it has been instrumentalized in a way by developed country to suggest that we should go and look outside the UNFCCC, that we should maybe look at the existing funding mechanism, so having a mosaic of solution inside, outside the UNFCCC, and having like a lot of different options on the table. So in that regard, I think is really diverting the debate on what should be agreed at this COP, meaning a financial facility under the operating entity under the convention. So this is, there are clear reasons why we want this discussion to happen under the UNFCCC and not all over the place. It does not mean that what's actually being said, the Global Shield, the different pledges, are not needed. We need money right now to help communities, to help the most vulnerable. But we should also really focus on make sure that a mechanism is established under the UNFCCC to guarantee long-term finance, to guarantee accountability, transparency, to guarantee that there is equity and climate justice as key principle. Happening outside the UNFCCC, we don't know actually what form it could get and how we can really go forward regarding loss and damage finance. So the mosaic of solution is not a bad idea as such, but we should be really careful to not get distracted on what we should see happening at this COP and the next ones.
Perfect. I think that summarizes it very well. So thank you, Rebecca. Yes, a question here.
Thank you. I'm from Pakistan, and we've been trying to push for the loss and damage, as you would know, on multiple fronts, and we just recently got offered some money under the Global Shield network. My question is, it seems as if developed countries are looking to avoid the problem of liability.
Okay, so do feel free actually to come up to the stage if you'd like to use the microphone up here, or you could shout. Thank you very much for the question. I'll repeat it for anyone that didn't hear. So the question stated that it seems like one of the major sticking points is the language of liability and developed countries wanting to avoid being held liable for any climate-related damages or historical responsibilities. Question one was, is there a method that could be agreed on at COP27 which avoids the language of liability or legal responsibility but still allows the same benefits that we would expect under a loss and damage finance mechanism to flow? And the second question was, looking beyond the UNFCCC framework, there may be the opportunity to reform organizations such as the multilateral development banks that have themselves caused significant damage in the past in relation to the structure of their finance. I think, that's correct? Okay, thank you. So who would like to talk? Maybe we can start with the first question about avoiding liability but allowing the same benefits. Does anyone have any perspectives on whether that's possible? I'm not sure, Sharon, if you'd like to comment on this one.
Well, thanks. In regard to the liability, it's like, as said, the developing countries do not stipulate clearly. I mean, there is no institutionalization or specific mechanism for loss and damage, like who should be facilitated or given the technical support when and at which moment. And so the conversation that has not come to, the negotiations have not reached to conclusion, like there is no specific framework for funding mechanism. I think we need to raise the voices yet, but we hope for the best outcome. Maybe I did not catch up the next question, the proper flow of the question, but that is it.
Great, thank you. Would you like to speak on the liability point, Rebecca?
Yes, so the liability issue was raised at the very beginning of this COP when we shaped the agenda item. You may have seen that there were like 2 disclaimers, notably not talking about loss and damage finance as a base for liability and compensation. This is actually not new. It's coming from the Paris Agreement, actually the Paris decision, where you have a paragraph 51. Remember that one because it's a very tricky and contentious one, where it's actually the United States who really pushed to make sure that Article 8, who is the base and recognizing loss and damage, could not be a base for liability and compensation. So this idea of liability have for a long time being rejected and opposed by developed country, US first. And it's of course a problem, a moral problem, because we know that there is a debt, a climate debt, and there will be a very good reason to ask for liability. But moving forward and looking at other way to achieve the same objective, to receive loss and damage money and compensation, I think the common but differentiated responsibility is a key principle. The polluters pay principle should be much more broad in the negotiation as well. It's still a very timid word that we don't hear so much. I think also the question of vulnerability is essential here, because when you look at it in maybe even a scientific way, you really realize where the needs are and who should benefit from such a fund. Also interesting to know, so we are here like negotiating, having political tactics and power balances, but it's interesting to realize that the liability question regarding the climate crisis is also happening outside the doors of the UNFCCC, specifically regarding climate litigation. You may be aware that a lot of trials going on regarding climate inaction, polluters having their polluters being forced to pay their own debt and so on and so forth. So that's also a very interesting trends to watch, because I think it will also maybe solve juridic and legal question that we are trying to not discuss here in those rooms. So that's also something to watch.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Jefferson, I'm not sure if you'd like to comment upon the Multilateral Development Bank question and the role that they have to play within this.
As for me, I'm not that, really in depth with the liabilities technicalities, but what I can say is that, for example, in the Philippines, as I've mentioned earlier, we have this national inquiry on climate change. Since Sharon mentioned earlier that there is no instrument that can really hold these countries or these companies accountable, this particular document, um, in with these findings, it really includes how communities are being affected, and because it was investigated by a commission on human rights, it can be used in for example in the Philippines, since in our government, in our laws, since this mechanism can be because this was made by investigation, so it was it has data that can really provide what particular impacts that these countries and companies have done to the communities. So yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I think we had a question from the front here. Yes.
Actually, after 2 weeks, also the mics in the room are a bit tired, so we'd ask you to come to the stage. Sorry.
Thanks. So thanks very much for the interventions. I have a question particularly for Jefferson and Sharon and George as well, coming from a youth organisation. I mean, I think we've seen youth really particularly galvanise around loss and damage. And just from my own perception, like the number of youth attending COP26 went up a lot. Just would be great to hear about from Sharon about African youth and civil society, big expectations and hopes for this COP, but maybe some of your reflections about what happens afterwards on this issue. And same to Jefferson and George, like how are you going to be working as youth groups together going forward? Thanks.
Oh, thanks. Nice question. I think this COP, either, I don't know whether it's me or majority, but I have recognized that youth have taken part so much in this COP. I think we are awake now and we are taking part in most of the interventions. But another thing that I should appreciate, I've been attending the capacity building sessions, and like most of the organizations or the institutions that are taking part in climate interventions have promised to be engaged in different activities related to climate change and related interventions, and have, been suggesting that the youth will be taking part and there will be program changing, capacity building moments or programs changing between the youth. And thus, but again, I think we still need to advocate for the youth to be engaged in different activities. Since we are capable, we should fight for justice. As we know, there is no climate justice without rights for the youth, rights for the women and marginalized communities. So we need to speak more, but again, to inspire the youth to speak on ourselves, since we are the future. Tomorrow is ours. The impacts that hits today on climate change or global extreme events, if triggers, then the youth will be impacted. If not the youth, then our kids with the youth will be impacted. Thus, we need more interventions and voices to be heard, but again, to empower the youth, to encourage the badges or sponsorship that have been on the way to sponsoring the youth. That is what I think.
As for the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, just before actually COP27, we established, or we released demands, 7 demands for the COP27 parties to adhere during this year's conference. And I think 3 of our demands was already established, but since we are nearing in the end of the COP and we are not yet, completely getting all the demands of the youth, we will still be holding these demands to be established up until, if until the COP28. But as for the different countries, because Loss and Damage is a global network, some of the countries that is part of the coalition, they have, some of them, the loss and damage concept is still pretty new, especially in the Philippines. So not everyone is really informed or knowledgeable about this thing. So we will also try to really spread the message of these calls locally, especially in the global south.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the story from the UK Youth Climate Coalition perspective is that each year around summertime we meet, because we have members from all over the country, we meet at some point, somewhere in the country. This year is in Cambridge in the UK, and we try and pick one topic to focus on as a campaign for that year. And every time we try and pick the big ticket item, the thing that we really think we can see momentum building on, and an area that we consider hasn't really been addressed properly within the UNFCCC process or even within international climate discussions up to a point in time. And this year, of the sort of 15 members of our group, of the COP working group within the organization, everyone was in clear agreement that loss and damage is the one item this year that cannot be ignored. It's the one opportunity to change practice as has been done, because it opens so many of these questions that people wouldn't touch before around liability or historical responsibility or reparations within the climate sphere. And we noticed that between summertime and November, you go from a situation where members of developed country delegations would say that loss and damage is absolutely not going to happen. It's an item that they refuse to talk about. And in just a few short months, we've got to a stage where it can't be ignored, and people, across popular media, will say that this conference has been a failure without any sort of reasonable agreement or consensus decision on loss and damage that developing countries can support. So I suppose the youth role within that is to try and ask the obvious questions, I suppose, that seem obvious to those coming out of school, for example. We have a few members of our delegation that are very recently graduated from school, but also we network with people here who are 16, even younger. And to those people, the question of climate justice seems obvious. It's exactly what they've been taught in school before. It's you need to share, you need to be responsible in your actions. And that's something that young people look at the international climate process and they say, why are none of those principles there in a way that we've been taught it should be in the adult world? So I suppose that is the role of the youth organizations within Loss and Damage. And I'm happy that we can have panels like this where youth representation is relatively high. And I suppose we try and speak on behalf of those youth who can't be here because it's so expensive to be in Egypt, as it will be next year in the UAE also.
If I may add something on the link between working with the youth and bringing the youth to understanding what loss and damage is about, and how to link that kind of work in our communities, in our towns, in our cities, to what we are living here as a part of, even though we all have this yellow badge of observers, in the end we're part of some kind of an elite of people who can come inside here, and we know that very well, also concerning activists from the Global South. So over the summer we circulated a survey to Italian people aged 16 to 30 something, and we were asking them how important is the issue of loss and damage for you, according to you, towards COP27. How much important is for you the issue of climate justice on the global stage? And although we received a lot of feedbacks, actually many more than we could imagine initially, we also received feedbacks with questions in terms of why are you asking me about loss and damage? It's something too complicated. I don't see the point in that. I, of course, agree we should fight for climate justice, but we don't have the elements to understand what you're asking with the survey. And the linking point is exactly here, in the need to make also young people understand that social justice at home, social justice in your community is very linked to justice in international relations in this case. Nobody ever talked about reparations inside these rooms. We were talking about compensations, but climate change is a very slow onset phenomenon that started more than 100 years ago, and our brain is not programmed to see it because it's something we do not touch, especially young people who still maybe sometimes don't have the elements to already know what they're observing somehow, and they call it with another name. In the same way, our parents and grandparents called it with another name before the knowledge that we have today. So the link perhaps it's exactly there in making them understand that justice and equity should be part of your home policies as well as international policies, as we are talking about a global phenomenon, as climate change has no borders. If we start from this point, young people as well could get to the point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacopo. I think now we'd like to try something a bit novel. So I'll pass over to Jacopo again for the instructions.
So as mentioned at the beginning of the session, as Italian Climate Network and United Kingdom Youth Coalition on Climate Change, we usually tend to transform the whole room of this side event in a discussing moment and not just having people speaking from the other part of the table. So we would ask also our speakers together with us to actually leave the stage for 20 minutes and regroup in the room and have we would say here in the UNF Travel C, inf chats on loss and damage, and we will get back to the stage with some ideas, questions, things that can come up from the room around the keywords that our speakers provided us today. So compensation, youth, tactics, and in this case as well, awareness and involvement. So for how strange it might sound, we're coming down there and we want to talk with you for at least 20 minutes before closing the panel with your ideas.
Test, test. Yeah.
All right. All right. 30 seconds, and then we start with the wrapping up. Do you agree, George?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. George.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions to our session. I think it's quite rare sometimes to see true experimentation within this space. So I hope you enjoyed the opportunity to do an event slightly differently to how things are done. We're going to do a quick kind of conclusion of what was said within each group, I think, before giving the speakers a final opportunity to share their thoughts. So I think just to cover what was said within the circle here, we talked quite a lot about the principle of how accessible loss and damage is as a topic, with people suggesting it's quite difficult as a newcomer to kind of following climate negotiations to understand really the complexities of discussions within the negotiating room, especially when it's not immediately obvious from the phrase loss and damage what that entails. Additionally, we talked about the difficulty of, how do you frame where the funding is going to come from. It's a question that we've seen a lot in the UK media over the past couple of weeks, is if we're going to pay loss and damage, or sometimes termed as climate reparations within the UNFCCC process, then where's that money going to come from? Is it going to come from fossil fuel subsidies that may otherwise be subsidizing the cost of gas or petrol, for example, which may then have implications for a just transition to a renewable economy? So those were some of the main topics we talked about. Jacopo, what did you hear from your group?
Thank you, George, for sharing. Actually, I had to test my skills in French and Spanish altogether with a very mixed group at the bottom of the room, and I would like to thank my friends from Congo, Bolivia, and the Netherlands for having shared their ideas. And just in a nutshell, before leaving the floor to our speakers to hear their final, let's say, ideas on the afternoon, I would like very much to thank my group, and especially Kathy from Congo, for having shared the view of an organization representing 1,100 organizations in Congo DRC, and the reason they are here, and why did they came to the COP, also why did they came to this event we organized on loss and damage. Donc merci pour avoir partagé votre opinion et votre idée, because they said we did not come to Sharm el-Sheikh for tourism. We did not come to COP27 for tourism. We want to leave this COP with solutions. We want to bring good news to our people when we go back. And I think that's the most powerful message we can have today on loss and damage, perhaps also apart from technicalities and funding arrangements, which are at the core of negotiations. But I think we all need to go home with good news for our people. So you give the floor to the others.
Fantastic, thank you. So I can now pass, I think, to Sharon for an overview of what was covered within your group.
Thanks, George. To sum up everything that we discussed, we suggested that there should be clear definition of loss and damage, what loss and damage is, and what are the bases of compensation. Again, we thought that at some moment, compensation to the affected parties is regarded as an international aid. It's not an aid, rather should be subjected to the problem based on the scenario, but also should be fair or justice with equitable distribution of finance. We spoke a lot, but that is a summary of everything that we had in discussion.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So I think before we finish, I'd like to give the opportunity for our speakers. Unfortunately, Rebecca had to run back to the negotiating room to do her day job. But I'd like to give the opportunity to the speakers to make a closing statement about what you'd like to see over the next 48 hours as we get to the final crunch point of the negotiations. So Jefferson, would you like to start?
This year's COP, it is great to see that the loss and damage agenda is already in the table. And the last 48 hours is the most crucial part of this year's COP. I mean, in every COP. But whatever result, it would be the youth from the global north and global south who are studying, who are really pushing to advocate for loss and damage and its technicalities. Will still forward our calls to really call our global leaders to establish this finance. And I think the biggest indicator, as we all know, of this year's COP will be the establishment of that. So we need to really push for it, and we need to see it at the end tomorrow.
Thank you. Sharon?
Thank you so much. I stick on the same thing that I wish to hear that there is clear framework for Santiago Network. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Jacopo, your reflections.
Well, I think that 99% of us came here with that kind of expectation. And that's also the reason we felt comfortable with giving this title to the event. And I had the feeling for the first time in 30 years of COPs and conferences after Rio 92, for the first time, delegates are somehow comfortable with the idea as well. Not all of them, but most of them have understood that grouping and building a coalition as the one that is currently negotiating this part of the agreement could lead to the result somehow. We are talking about something very important in terms of governance of the process globally. We have been hearing for many years that the Paris Agreement was about mitigation and adaptation. After that, for too many years, we have failed on mitigation, so that we needed more adaptation to respond somehow. That's one of the main narratives. And now, here at COP27, we see presentations, we hear delegates in the rooms, we see slides inside events where there are 3 pillars under the Paris Agreement and not 2 anymore. And the third is loss and damage. As a consequence, as a preemptive action, of course, in that sense, but loss and damage has been there as a political topic for ages, and perhaps now that the other front, let's say, of those who do not want to establish a fund or facility are a bit more, how can I say, a bit weaker politically and divided than in the past, also in terms of bargaining power in these rooms. Now perhaps we see a window of opportunity, and that's the window of opportunity these countries are actually walking through. And I would like to stress the fact that, as I was mentioning before, that as climate change is, always has been, and will be in the future a global problem with no borders, and with everything that we know from the IPCC, from the reports on how fragile some countries are. And we saw that with here in this COP, we have been hearing a lot of times that Pakistan has been the changing point of this narrative this year. But you know that much better than me. Before Pakistan, there was Mozambique, and before Mozambique, there were several others. So perhaps it's a good moment to push on this. And we have heard from the presidency of COP27 that this moment will last 3 years, perhaps 2 to 3 years until COP29. So what I usually, when we have this kind of side events, I want to leave with some homeworks, not just reflections. And I think the homework for all our organizations and also the people in the room, if you will like to join us in this fight, is to continue talking about loss and damage, loss and damage, and loss and damage, and specifically about this facility to come for the next 2 years at least.
Thank you. I think my final reflections are just ones that became obvious to anyone who would have been at the People's Plenary earlier during the day, when there was a room full of 1,000 members of the civil society organizations represented here at COP27. And during that moment of solidarity and hope and expectation, there was also a clear feeling of anger, I suppose. And it's obvious to anyone who has been here throughout the week that the people arrive at the conference with maybe cynicism, but certainly a big dose of hope. And I think it's traditionally been the case with one or two examples that people head home slightly let down from what their hope was when they arrived. And I think this year felt different. It felt like a bit of a building block from all of the momentum that was built up from Glasgow and all of the momentum on loss and damage that's come throughout the year. It felt like this may be the opportunity to finally break through on financial justice within the UNFCCC process. And it's kind of become clear over the past few days that language on a finance facility is still being blocked by the same old actors. And I do wonder whether tonight and tomorrow we will see almost two big blocks of the civil society movement and the negotiating hall coming together at a head on potentially quite an angry point around here's something that we made very clear as our minimum expectation and that not being delivered on. And I'm very interested to see, I suppose, what the reaction to that will be, whether anything can be taken from the negotiating room over the next next few hours. But there certainly could have not been a better time to host this event. Each year we'll come back more hopeful than the last, hopefully, anyway, and we know that the solidarity amongst civil society is there to force this agenda forward. So I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone for coming for this event and caring about this issue. I look forward to seeing everyone maintaining that anger if it's needed, or the celebration if that's warranted over the next week or so and beyond. And a massive thank you especially to our wonderful speakers for coming out and sharing their expertise with us.